Remember when a first-time director cast a man with zero acting experience in one of the most demanding lead roles of the decade, a Cambodian doctor who had survived 4 years of torture, starvation, and the murder of his entire family under one of the worst genocides in human history. And that man won an Academy Award for reliving, on camera, the exact nightmare he had barely escaped in real life. He was the second non-professional actor ever to win an acting Oscar. 12 years later, he was shot dead in an alley a few miles from Hollywood, refusing to hand over a gold locket containing a photograph of the wife who had died in his arms in a Cambodian rice field. His killers were convicted on the same day the world confirmed the death of the dictator whose regime had destroyed his life. Directed by Roland Joffé in his feature debut, written by Bruce Robinson and produced by David Putnam for Goldcrest Films, starring Sam Waterston as New York Times correspondent Sidney Schanberg, and Dr. Haing S. Ngor as Cambodian journalist Dith Pran, with John Malkovich, Julian Sands, Craig T. Nelson, and Spalding Gray. The Killing Fields told the true story of two journalists caught in the fall of Cambodia to the Khmer Rouge in 1975, and the 4.5-year separation that followed. It won 3 Academy Awards. It remains one of the most harrowing films ever made about genocide, friendship, and survival. Today, we're counting down 13 weird facts about The Killing Fields. And stick around for number 1, because the way the real man at the center of this story died is so cruelly, impossibly ironic that it almost feels scripted, and it isn't. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Is this the most emotionally devastating film ever made? Or does another film hit you harder? Make the case below. Alright, this one is heavy. Let's get into it. When director Roland Joffé began searching for someone to play Dith Pran, the Cambodian journalist and interpreter who is the emotional center of the entire film, the character whose survival the second half of the movie is built around, he was not looking for a star. He was looking for authenticity that no trained actor could manufacture. Casting director Pat Golden conducted an extensive search before settling on a man who had never acted professionally in his life, never been on a film set, never read a script, never considered acting as anything he might ever do. His name was Haing S. Ngor, and he was a doctor. What Ngor had instead of acting experience was something far more valuable and far more terrible for this specific role. He had lived it. He was a real survivor of the exact genocide the film depicted. A man who had endured the Khmer Rouge regime firsthand and escaped with his life when millions did not. Joffé deemed that lived experience essential to the role's emotional depth, more important than any amount of technical training. The bet was enormous. You do not typically hand the most demanding role in a major motion picture to someone who has never acted. But Joffé understood that what The Killing Fields needed could not be performed by someone imagining it. It needed to be carried by someone who remembered it. Ngor remembered all of it. Before he was an actor, before he was a refugee, before he was anything the world would come to know him as, Haing Ngor was a respected physician in Phnom Penh. Born in 1940 in rural Cambodia under the French protectorate, he had clawed his way up through scholarship after scholarship, working through nights, until by 1975 he was a 35-year-old obstetrician-gynecologist with a clinic, a reputation, and a wife he loved named Chang Mai Huoi. He had built exactly the life his father had dreamed for him. Knowledge as light, medicine as the highest calling, a future secured. Then, in April 1975, the Khmer Rouge took Phnom Penh and emptied the city. 2 million people were driven into the countryside within hours. And under the new regime, being a doctor was not a source of status. It was a death sentence. The Khmer Rouge targeted the educated, the professional, the intellectual, anyone who wore glasses, anyone who spoke a foreign language, anyone whose hands were too soft to belong to a peasant. Ngor understood immediately that his entire identity, everything he had spent his life building, was now the single most dangerous thing about him. To survive, he would have to erase the doctor completely. The man who would one day win an Oscar for playing a survivor first had to perform the role of his life in reality, pretending, for 4 years, to be nobody at all. The cruelty of Ngor's survival is almost impossible to absorb. Captured and accused of being an educated man, a spy, a doctor in disguise, he denied all of it. When the Khmer Rouge severed one of his fingers with a knife and hung him over a smoldering fire for days to extract a confession, he maintained the lie. He begged for death and somehow survived, because admitting what he was would have meant immediate execution. He concealed his medical training so completely that it cost him the one thing his training existed to prevent. His wife, Chang Mai Huoi, died in childbirth during the regime. She died in his arms in a labor gone wrong, while her husband, one of the most qualified obstetricians in the country, a specialist in exactly the medical crisis unfolding in front of him, could do nothing, because to reveal that he knew how to save her, to demonstrate any medical knowledge at all in front of the Khmer Rouge, would have exposed him and killed them both. He held his wife while she and their unborn child died, possessing the precise skill that might have saved them, forced into total helplessness by the need to survive. There is no version of this fact that gets easier the longer you look at it. The man went on to win an Academy Award for playing someone else's suffering. His own was worse. The Killing Fields is, by reputation, one of the most authentic and immersive recreations of 1970s Cambodia ever committed to film. The cityscapes, the countryside, the textures of a nation falling apart. None of it could be filmed in Cambodia. In the early 1980s, when the production was being mounted, Cambodia remained effectively closed, devastated, and politically impossible for a Western film crew to enter. The country that the film is entirely about was, for practical purposes, off limits to the people making the film about it. The solution was Thailand. The production relocated to Thai locations, much of it near the Cambodian border, with significant filming around Phuket, a place that would later be known to the world primarily as a tropical paradise resort destination. The lush landscapes and carefully reconstructed war-torn cityscapes of the Killing Fields are Thailand, standing in for a Cambodia that no one could reach. The geographical proximity provided authenticity, but the deeper authenticity came from somewhere else entirely. Because the production was filming near the border, in a region that had absorbed enormous numbers of people fleeing the Khmer Rouge, it had access to something no set decoration could provide: the actual survivors. The recreation of Cambodia's catastrophe was populated in large part by the people who had genuinely lived through it. The crowds in the Killing Fields, the masses of people being driven from the city, the refugees, the prisoners, the faces filling the frame during the film's most harrowing sequences were not, in large part, professional extras. Many of them were real Cambodian refugees who had fled the actual Khmer Rouge regime and ended up in Thailand, the same country where the film was being made. They were not performing displacement. They had lived it. They were asked to reenact for cameras the precise horror that had driven them from their homes and destroyed their families. This made certain scenes emotionally overwhelming during filming in a way that no fictional production typically experiences. For the refugees in the frame, the staged forced marches and prison camps and fields of death were not imagination. They were memory, reconstructed around them by a film crew, with the survivors standing inside their own trauma made physical again. The Skullfield sequence, the moment the film takes its title from, the encounter with the mass graves and human remains, was shot in real heat exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, surrounded by replica human skulls based on careful museum research, with people who had walked through the genuine version of exactly this. The film's overwhelming authenticity wasn't a triumph of production design. It was a presence of real grief, standing in the frame, doing the unimaginable work of reliving the worst thing that had ever happened to it. The phrase that became the film's title, that entered the global vocabulary as a defining term for the Cambodian genocide, that now appears in history, books, and memorials and academic studies worldwide, was not invented by a screenwriter, a journalist, or a historian. It was coined by Dith Pran himself, the real man Haing and Ngor was portraying. As Pran made his desperate escape through the Cambodian countryside, he encountered the horrifying clusters of corpses and skeletal remains that the Khmer Rouge had left across the landscape, and he gave them a name: the Killing Fields. He used the phrase from the very first day of his reunion with Sidney Schanberg in a Thai refugee camp in 1979. This means the film's title comes directly from the lived experience of its real subject, the words of a man describing what he personally walked through, adopted as the name for a film in which another survivor of the same genocide would play him. Pran resettled in the United States of America, became a photojournalist for the New York Times, and spent the rest of his life as an advocate, determined that the new generation of Cambodians would never forget the faces of the relatives and friends who were killed. He survived. He gave the catastrophe its name, and then he watched a fellow survivor win an Academy Award for telling his story, using the words he himself had spoken first in a refugee camp on the day he finally got free. If you've made it this far into a story this heavy, you already understand why this film matters, so hit the like button and subscribe to keep these coming. Drop a comment. Had you ever heard Dith Pran's real story before, or only known him through the film? Tell us below. Alright, back to it. Spalding Gray, the actor and monologist, had a relatively small part in the Killing Fields as an American consul's aide. For most actors, a minor supporting role in someone else's epic would be a footnote, a line on a resume, a few weeks of work, a story to tell at parties. For Gray, the experience of making the film became the raw material for one of the most celebrated performances of his own career in an entirely different medium. He took his time in Thailand making The Killing Fields and turned it into a monologue called Swimming to Cambodia, a sprawling, searching, very funny and very dark solo performance about his experience on the film, the history of Cambodia, the secret American bombing campaign, and his own restless search for what he called a perfect moment. The monologue began as a 4-hour theater piece performed over 2 nights and was eventually condensed and filmed by director Jonathan Demme in 1987, becoming a landmark of the solo performance form. So, a minor supporting role in The Killing Fields generated a completely separate, independently acclaimed work of art, one that used the experience of making a film about the Cambodian genocide as a lens for examining American complicity, personal privilege, and the strange position of a comfortable Western actor parachuting into the reconstruction of someone else's catastrophe. The bit part player walked away from The Killing Fields with more than a credit. He walked away with the defining work of his career. The Killing Fields ends with the reunion of Schonberg and Pran in the Thai refugee camp, one of the most emotionally overwhelming final scenes in modern cinema. And over that reunion, and over the closing information about the fate of Cambodia, the film plays John Lennon's Imagine. For many viewers, it is a transcendent, devastating choice, the perfect elegiac note to close a film about loss and survival and the dream of a world without the divisions that produce atrocity. For others, it is one of the most baffling needle drops in film history, and the objection is not frivolous. The argument against it is pointed. The Killing Fields is a film about communism producing one of the worst genocides in recorded history. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people killed, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population, by a regime explicitly built on radical communist ideology. And the song chosen to close it is one popularly understood as imagining a world with no possessions, no countries, no religion, a vision that critics have long read as broadly sympathetic to exactly the collectivist ideals the Khmer Rouge claim to pursue. Whether the choice is a profound humanist statement or a jarring tonal misjudgment has been debated for 40 years. The film also opens with a Beatles-adjacent track. Paul McCartney's Band on the Run plays on a soldier's radio early on, bookending the entire genocide with the 2 principal songwriters of the Beatles. Joffé clearly intended the music to mean something. Exactly what? Audiences still cannot agree on. The music of The Killing Fields did not come from a traditional film composer working in the orchestral idiom that war epics typically demand. It came from Mike Oldfield, the British multi-instrumentalist best known for Tubular Bells, the sprawling instrumental rock album whose opening had become globally famous as the theme from The Exorcist. Oldfield was a rock musician and experimentalist, a man associated with progressive instrumental soundscapes rather than the scoring of historical drama, and he built much of the score for The Killing Fields on synthesizers, orchestrated with the help of David Bedford. The choice was divisive then and remains divisive now. To some listeners, Oldfield's electronic textures are intrusive, a dated wash of synthesizer noise laid over images of genuine horror, the wrong instrument for the weight of the subject. To others, the score's traditional orchestral passages are majestic, and pieces like Pran's theme achieve a genuine elegiac power, while Requiem for a City, with its chorus of grieving voices, attempts to render in music the misery of 1 million people forced from their homes. What is not in dispute is the strangeness of the pairing, one of the most serious films about genocide ever made, scored by the man whose most famous work soundtracked a horror movie about demonic possession. The combination should not have worked. A great many people think it did anyway. Roland Joffé had never directed a feature film before The Killing Fields. He came from British television, and his appointment to direct a sweeping, expensive, logistically punishing epic about the Cambodian genocide, shot abroad in difficult conditions, in multiple languages, with a non-professional lead carrying half the film, was an enormous gamble on an untested talent. He was not yet 40. He had no track record in cinema to justify the scale of what he was being trusted with. Producer David Putnam, fresh off the success of Chariots of Fire, was effectively betting one of the most ambitious productions of his career on a director who had never made a film. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Joffé was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Director for his debut feature, extraordinarily rare achievement, and the film received 7 Oscar nominations in total, winning 3. Joffé followed it with The Mission in 1986, another acclaimed historical epic, cementing a reputation that The Killing Fields had established overnight. The pattern across these facts is becoming clear. The Killing Fields was a film built almost entirely on people doing things they had never done before. A first-time director, a first-time actor in the lead, a rock musician scoring his way through unfamiliar territory, a production attempting to recreate a catastrophe in a country that wasn't the one it happened in. By every conventional Hollywood metric, it should have collapsed under the weight of its own inexperience. Instead, it became a masterpiece. When Haing Ngor won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1985, he made history in more than one way. He was only the second non-professional actor ever to win a competitive acting Oscar, the first having been Harold Russell, the real-life disabled veteran who won for The Best Years of Our Lives in 1947. Ngor had no formal training, no prior credits, no career in the industry. He had walked onto a film set for the first time, played a survivor of the genocide he had personally survived, and beaten trained professional actors to the most prestigious award in the medium. He was also widely recognized as the first actor of Asian descent to win in that category, a genuine milestone in an industry that had spent most of its history marginalizing or excluding Asian performers entirely. But the deeper weight of the win was personal and almost unbearable. Ngor accepted an award for portraying suffering that he had not imagined or researched, but actually endured. The Academy was honoring a performance that was, in a real sense, not a performance at all, but a controlled act of remembering. He understood his own life through the Waryu's Buddhist lens of reincarnation and karmic cycles, and he reflected, with devastating simplicity, that perhaps in a previous life he had done something to hurt people, and in this life he had paid it back. He used his fame afterward exactly as you might hope, lecturing, advocating, forming organizations to aid displaced Cambodian refugees, working to bring the perpetrators of the genocide to justice. The Oscar was never the point for him. It was a platform. The two men most central to The Killing Fields, the real Dith Pran and the man who played him, Haing Ngor, both lived extraordinary lives after the events the film depicts, and both had those lives cut short in ways that compound the tragedy at the story's core. Dith Pran resettled in America, worked for years as a photojournalist at the New York Times, became one of the most dedicated and outspoken advocates for Cambodian human rights in the world, and gave the genocide the name by which history now knows it. He died of pancreatic cancer in March 2008, at the age of 65, with Sidney Schanberg, the journalist whose story the film tells, the friend who had searched for him for 4.5 years, at his bedside until the end. The two men had called each other brother. Haing Ngor's death came 12 years earlier and far more violently, and it is the subject of the final fact on this list, but the symmetry is worth pausing on. Two survivors of one of the worst atrocities in human history, who had both escaped the killing fields, who had both dedicated their post-survival lives to ensuring the world remembered what happened, one taken by cancer surrounded by a loved one, the other gunned down in an alley. Pran spent his final years insisting that the new generation must never forget the faces of those who were killed. He understood, better than almost anyone alive, how easily the world moves on from horror. He spent everything he had left refusing to let it. Here is the fact that makes everything else on this list almost unbearable to hold. Haing Ngor survived 4 years of torture, starvation, forced labor, and the systematic murder of his family under the Khmer Rouge. He survived having a finger cut off and being hung over a fire. He survived watching his wife die in his arms while hiding the medical knowledge that might have saved her. He escaped to Thailand, built a new life in America, won an Academy Award, and became a global ambassador for justice. And then, on February 25, 1996, outside his apartment in Los Angeles Chinatown, he was confronted by 3 young gang members who wanted his Rolex watch and the gold chain around his neck. He gave them the watch. The chain he would not give. It held a locket containing a photograph of Chong Mai Huoi, the wife who had died in his arms in a Cambodian rice field 20 years earlier. The only thing he had left of her. He had not been able to save her once. He would not abandon her a second time. The attackers shot him. He died on a Los Angeles sidewalk, a few miles from where Hollywood had given him fame, with his wife's photograph pressed against his chest. He was 55. His 3 killers, members of a Chinatown street gang, were convicted on April 16, 1998, the very same day the world received confirmation that Pol Pot, the architect of the genocide that had destroyed Ngor's life, had died in the Cambodian jungle. The man who survived the killing fields was murdered in an American alley over a photograph of his dead wife, and his killers were convicted on the day his ultimate tormentor finally died. As his friend Sidney Schanberg said, he survived Pol Pot. He could not survive a Los Angeles alley. So there you have it. 13 facts about a film whose lead had survived the exact genocide he was hired to portray, which couldn't be filmed in the country it was about, which was populated by real refugees reliving their own trauma, scored by a rock musician, directed by a complete unknown, and titled with words first spoken by its real subject in a refugee camp on the day he finally got free. Haing Ngor won an Academy Award for reliving the worst years of his life. Deeth Pran gave the catastrophe its name and spent his remaining years making sure no one forgot it. Both men are gone now. The film remains, not as entertainment, but as a record, which is exactly what both of them wanted it to be. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who has never seen The Killing Fields and doesn't know the real story behind it. Some things are worth remembering precisely because they're hard to look at. Until next time, the dead are still crying out for justice. Deeth Pran said that, he meant it.